Hello, and welcome back to the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing our series on Ralph Waldo Emerson, specifically the journals. We are on Journal 10, subtitled The Wide World Number 9, and let us begin. Quote, "Pass not unblessed the genius of the place," end quote. Saturday evening, December 21st, 1822. To the genius of the future I dedicate my page. What follows is in Latin, and I do not have any translation provided, so I will skip over it. If the misanthrope take refuge in analogy, it will fail him. For though we bewail the imperfection of sublunary things, yet all things in the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdom have a perfection, which, though not attained in the 100 instances, is attained in the 1,000, is attained much oftener than not. Man in many trials has failed, but now a preparation is made for another experiment, which begins with infinite advantages. I need not name the daily blessings which are diffused over the present generation, and distinguish them above antiquity. I notice only that they possess Christianity, and a civilization more deeply engrafted in the mind, by reason of the extraordinary aids it derives from inventions and discoveries, than ever it has before been. It is the nature of these advantages to multiply themselves. Providence ordains that every improvement extend an influence of infinite extent over the face of society. For centuries back, the progress of human affairs has appeared to indicate some better era, and finally, when all events were prepared, God has opened a new theater for his ultimate trial. This country is daily rising to a higher comparative importance and attracting the eyes of all the rest of the world to the development of its embryo greatness. Christmas, December 25th. If, as saith Voltaire, all that is related of Alfred the Great be true, I know not the man that ever lived more worthy of the gratitude of posterity. I hope the reservation means nothing. There is not one incredible assertion made either of his abilities, his character, or his actions. Besides, it was not an age, nor were Saxon monks the men, to invent and adorn another Chiropedia. Sharon Turner, an ambitious flashing writer, and elsewhere a loon, hath done well by Alfred. His praises rest not upon monkish eulogy or vague tradition, but upon facts. December 26th, 1822. I have heard this evening, and shall elsewhere record, Professor Everett's lecture upon the Eleusinian Mysteries, Dodona, and St. Sophia's Temple. Though the lecture contained nothing original and no remarkable views, yet it was an account of antiquities bearing everywhere that fine Roman hand, and presented in the inimitable style of our Cicero. Quote, "Bigotry and philosophy are the opposite poles of the judgment, and the skepticism of Hume and Gibbon is as different as the superstition of the Catholics from the freedom of the Protestant." End quote. Professor E. Saturday evening, January 11th. Quote, "My bosom's Lord sits lightly on his throne." End quote. I cannot distinctly discern the cause. Tomorrow he will sit heavily there, and after a few days more he shall cease to be. The connections which he nursed with the earthly society shall be broken off, and the memory of his individual influence shall be obliterated from human hearts. It may chance that he will resume his thought elsewhere, that while the place from whence he passed forgets him, he shall nourish the fires of a pure ambition in some freer sanctuary than this world holds. It is possible that the infinity of another world may so crowd his conception as to divest him of that cumbrous sense of the self that weighs him down, until he lose his individual existence in his efforts for the universe. Emerson changes the subject midway to time. The years of infancy fled, and those toys dwindled away to make room for the splendid hopes and enthusiastic resolutions of youth. The sky was not so bright, and alas, not so changeable as its promises. It reveled in the sight of beauty, and the sound of music, and the motion of the limbs, in the intercourse of friends, and in all the joys of a pleasant and gorgeous world. But the crimson flush went from its cheek, and the joyous light from its eye. Its bones hardened into manhood, and its years departed beyond the flood. Reason watched them as they departed, and was bitterly mortified to find how insignificant they became in the view. Those changes and events which had engaged the mind by their gigantic greatness sunk now to pygmy dimensions, and so dim were the images upon the memory that it was hard to believe that they were not altogether a dream. After a few more turnings of the globe in its orbit, manhood, age, and life itself will have passed, and as I advance, that which I have left behind will continually grow less and less. As I reach and pass successively the several epochs of existence, the things of former pursuit will degenerate in my esteem. All will be the unremembered as if they had never been. The mind writes daily in its recollections of the past but one epitaph upon time: vanity of vanities, all is vanity. God forbid that this be the faithful history of the universe. Emerson changes the subject here to moral sense. There is one distinction amid these fading phenomena, one decided distinction which is real and eternal, and which will survive nature. I mean the distinction of right and wrong. Your opinions upon all other topics, and your feelings with regard to this world, in childhood, youth, and age, perpetually change. Your perceptions of right and wrong never change. You can dismiss the world from your mind, and almost abolish in your imagination the domination of sense, but you can never bury in your breast the sense of offended justice. The mind may lose its acquaintance with other minds, and may abandon without a sigh this glorious universe as a tent of the night to dwell in. But it cannot part with its moral principle, by which it becomes akin to the extraordinary intelligences that are to accompany its everlasting journey to the throne of God. If there be anything real under heaven or in heaven, the perception of right and wrong relates to that reality. Dogmatists and philosophers may easily convince me that my mind is but the abode of many passing shadows, by the belief of whose existence about me I am mocked. I shall not very sturdily combat this ancient skepticism, because to my mind and to every mind it has often seemed problematical whether or not it was cheated by an unsubstantial edifice of thought. But it is in the constitution of the mind to rely with firmer confidence upon the moral principle, and I reject at once the idea of a delusion in this. This is woven vitally into the thinking substance itself, so that it cannot be diminished or destroyed without dissipating forever that spirit which it inhabited. Upon the foundation of my moral sense, I ground my faith in the immortality of the soul, in the existence and activity of good beings, and in the promise of rewards accommodated hereafter to the vicious or virtuous dispositions which were cultivated here. The great citizenship of the universe, which all souls partake, has this for its common bond and charter, which none may violate, without taking upon themselves the peril of losing its infinite privileges. Upon the bounded field of this earth, nations upon nations of men have expired in succession, and borne to other and unseen countries the minds that dwelled here for a space. And all the individuals of this host have consented together in one respect alone, namely, the acknowledgment of this inward tribunal of thought and action. They obeyed or disobeyed its law, and they suffered or rejoiced as they might, but not one ever escaped from this high, unyielding, universal thraldom which the author of mind has created upon the mind. January 19th, 1823. The ideas of deity and religious worship readily find admission to the mind, and are readily abused. The clown on a dunghill can exalt his capacity to these truths, and is delighted and flattered by his consciousness of a new and transcendent power. God is infinitely above the whole creation, and he that aspires to worship him feels that his mounting spirit leaves the rest of the universe beneath his feet. Enthusiasm is therefore apt to generate in uncultivated minds a rash and ignorant contempt for the slow modes of education and the cautious arts of reasoning by which enlightened men arrive at wisdom, because they have themselves acquired this surpassing conception without the irksome toil of the intermediate steps. The boor becomes philosopher at once, and boldly eschews the dogmas of a religious creed from the exuberance of a coarse imagination. The tumults of a troubled mind are mistaken for the inspiration of an apostle, and the strength of excited feelings is substituted for the dispassionate and tardy induction, the comparison of scripture and reason which sanctions the devotions of moderate and liberal men. This has been everywhere found to be the history of religious error, not merely in the fanaticism of sects, but in the mistakes and superstitions of individuals. Every man's heaven is different, and is colored by the character and tone of feeling most natural to his mind. And in like manner his conceptions of the divine being will vary with the narrowness or justness of his modes of thinking. A mind which is remarkable for the truth and grandeur of its views in physical or metaphysical science will seldom be found the dupe of an unrelenting bigotry in its religious faith. Intellectual habits are not the sudden productions of an accident, but are formed slowly and confirmed from day to day by the influence of events, until they acquire an immutable strength that may outlast the period of this life. We think of God, therefore, as we think of man. Our views of human nature are liable to mistake. So are our views of the divine. Emerson changes subjects to the topic of prayer. The origin of prayer is no doubt to be traced in our comparison of finite beings with the infinite being. To obtain bread, we prayed our neighbor to impart from his store. But to obtain more than bread, to obtain our health or the life of a friend, to change the course of events is beyond our neighbor's power. Man remembered in his hour of need that there was a power above him, and uttered an ejaculation of his distress and his hopes, dictated by precisely the same emotions which moved him to address his earthly friend. Thus far the analogy is unexceptionable, but if pursued farther it fails. A judge has decreed the death of a criminal. The father and friends of the unfortunate man come before the tribunal to pray for his life, and plead with such importunity and eloquence that the judge consents to set aside the sentence. The character of the culprit is not amended, but the free course of justice is stopped, and society wronged by the earnestness of the supplication. In the ancient Persian religion, it is forbidden to petition for blessings to themselves individually. The prayer must extend to the whole Persian nation. In like manner, men came to their Maker to ask the favor of a partial event, a particular blessing that will prove prejudicial to the whole. And reasoning erroneously from human experience, they concluded that there was a certain force in prayer that would extend some control even over the mind of deity. Pity and irresolution in the human judge triumphed over his knowledge and his virtue, and the worshipper flattered himself with a hope that even God might be induced to hesitate by the offering of hecatombs and clamorous petition. The idolatry of every nation has had a tendency towards this belief that the arm of omnipotence could be chained down by sacrifice and entreaty, which the Hindu mythology has pursued to extravagant lengths. Prayer and penance, by their intrinsic virtue, will raise the worshipper above the power of gods and men, until it hurls the highest from his throne to make room for the devout usurper. Such a creed shocks the mind, but a secret bias to this belief is by no means uncommon in Christian countries. We are prone to think that the prayers of righteous men avail with God to check or change the course of events, which implies either that those events were ill-ordered before, or that they will take a wrong direction now. But both these hypotheses are inconsistent with our trust in the superintendence of providence over human affairs. The opposition of a general to a particular providence is often implied in prayer. Antiquity viewed the gods as the particular, fate as the general providence, and reconciles them by making fate absolute in the administration of the universe. Our perplexity springs from the union of both in the hands of one God. When God has ordained a change of events and the aspect of the world, suggesting the benefits of such a change to the mind, induces man to pray for it, and in this case the event coincides with the prayer, and it is interpreted as an especial interposition. With this solitary exception, men's prayers and the succession of events have no direct connection at all with each other. Human curiosity is forever engaged in seeking out ways and means of making a connection between the mind and the world of matter without, or the world of mind that has subsisted here, or the uniting bridge which shall join to future ages our own memory and deeds. This laudable curiosity should not neglect the formation of a bond which proposes to unite it, not to men, to matter, or to beasts, but to the unseen spirit of the universe. Our native delight in the intercourse of other beings urges us to cultivate with assiduity the friendship of great minds. But there is a mind to whom all their greatness is vanity and nothing, who did himself create and communicate all the intellect that exists. And there is a mode of intercourse provided by which we can approach this excellent majesty. That mind is God, and that mode is prayer. Quote, "And if by prayer incessant I could hope to change the will of him who all things can, I would not cease to weary him with my assiduous cries. But prayer against his absolute decree no more avails than breath against the wind, blown stifling back on him that breathes it forth." End quote. Paradise Lost, Book 11. Emerson changes the subject here to history. In reading history, it is hard to keep the eye steadily fixed upon any distinct moral view of the species, to which we may readily refer all the facts recorded of individuals. When we lay aside the book and think of man, our habitual theories regard him as a being in a state of probation, and we elevate the whole human race to an exalted equality of condition and destiny. Resume the page, and you are convinced at once that whatever opinions you are for yourself pleased to entertain concerning them, it never entered the minds of the majority of mankind in past ages that any such equality prevailed, or that they sustained any very sublime rank in the scale of creation. They have themselves shown a melancholy apathy, that is madness in the eye of a philanthropist, to every supposed nobleness of moral or intellectual design. They, that is the majority, have uniformly preferred the body to the mind, have permitted the free and excessive enjoyment of their sensual appetites, and chained down in torpid dreams the noble appetites of the soul. Instead of eating to live, men have lived to eat, to drink, and to be merry. And when ordinary means failed to bring about these grand purposes, then the extraordinary means of lies, murder, and robbery have been resorted to. No doubt good men are also found in the dramatic variety of the tale, to recall the mind to the theory from which it has wandered. But a good man in the world is aptly represented by a stag in the chase, as the one mark and victim, at whose cost the enjoyment of all the rest is procured. It seems to be a mockery to send us to this howling wilderness to pluck roses and fruits. The rose is blooming there, and the wild flowers hanging luxuriantly, but they cast their perfume in the tiger's den. Fanciful men, heated by the new wine of their imaginations, have attempted to woo the indignant reason into a better love of this darkened world. Epicurean pencils have painted it as perfectly accommodated to our powers of enjoyment, as fraught with every luxury, grace, and good which we desire to gain, as the palace of beauty and love, the vast mart of thought, friendship, society, and distinction, the home of virtue and the end of hope. So it is pictured, and so we believe in childhood, but our first mature glance at the actual state of society falls upon so much real deformity and such low moral and intellectual turpitude that the fair fabric of the imagination is speedily undermined. We find it difficult or impossible to reconcile the phenomena which we observe with any plausible hypotheses that heaven or earth have told us of their design, but humanity always resembles itself, and we readily recognize the imposture that attempts to describe better beings than men. For this more brilliant and seductive faith concerning man and the earth is deduced from false and partial representations of human nature, and makes only momentary converts when it is aided by the gay exhilaration which nature within and without awakens in youth, or by the few hours of moments that happens in a man's life when the heart is swelled and imagination is feasted at seasons of revel, magnificence, and public joy, whereas the time when the contrary conviction is forced upon the soul outnumber these moments 1,000-fold. The history of America since the Revolution is meager because it has been all that time under better government, better circumstances of religious, moral, political, commercial prosperity than any nation ever was before. History will continually grow less interesting as the world grows better. Professor Playfair of Edinburgh, the greatest or one of the greatest men of his time, died without a biography, for there was no incident in the life of a great and good man worth recording. Nelson and Bonaparte, men of abilities without principles, found 4 or 5 biographies apiece. The true epochs of history should be those successive triumphs which age after age the communities of men have achieved, such as the Reformation, the revival of letters, the progressive abolition of the slave trade. Whoever considers what kind of a spirit it is which prompts men to write will remark the improbability that a knowledge of the domestic manners of an ancient people should be transmitted to a remote age by any but the most fortuitous event. Literature grew out of the necessity of written monuments, and in its first expansion into an elegant art, while yet its mechanical advantages were rude and poor, it was devoted only to those great features on the face of the world which first forced themselves on the mind of the writer, to the history of laws, of colonies, of wars, and of religion. For his illustrations, the writer appealed to nature, and upon the early discovery of the delight given by these appeals was formed a new department of the art which was called poetry. Emerson changes the subject to domestic matters. If we had a series of faithful portraits of private life in Egypt, Assyria, Greece, and Rome, we might relinquish without a sigh their national annals. The great passions which move a whole nation and the common sense of mankind are alike everywhere, and these determine the foreign relations and the political counsels of men. But private life hath more delicate varieties which differ in unlike circumstances. Our vague and pompous outlines of history serve but to define in geographical and chronological limits the faint vestiges we possess of former nations. But of what mighty moment is it that we know the precise scene of a virtue or a vice? Give us the bare narrative of the moral beings engaged, the moral feelings concerned in the result, and you have answered all our purpose, all the ultimate design which leads the mind to explore the past. That is, of a speculative mind, apart from all the purposes of government and policy, for the purposes of another world rather than for this. For the history of nations is but the history of private virtues and vices collected in a more splendid field, a wider sky. To little purpose you would show the curious philosopher a mighty forest extending at a distance its 1,000 majestic trees. A single branch, a stem, a leaf in his hand is of more value to him for all the purposes of science. Even the eternal geometer, in the fancy of Leibniz, deduces the past and present condition of the universe from the examination of the single atom. Emerson changes the subject to solitude. The gods and wild beasts are both, to a proverb, fond of solitude. Thought makes the difference between the solitude of the god and that of the lion. Emerson changes the subject again to imagination versus thought. In the entry of the saloon there has been considerable bustle, but an individual now stood there to throw off his blue cloak, whose figure arrested at once the whole attention of 2 or 3 guests who chanced to be looking towards the door. A whisper instantly circulated to inform the party of the presence of a most distinguished and welcome guest. Everyone rose at his entrance, and the stranger advanced with an air of dignified majesty toward the center of the hall. Franklin saluted him with evident respect and introduced him to the company as the first American president. There was no brilliant sparkle in his eye which attracted notice, nor rapid change of expression in his countenance. His countenance was composed, and graceful dignity marked every motion, so that he was rather the Jupiter than the Apollo of the group. This, however, was manifest, that from the time of his entrance, during all that long conference, the first place in that society was invariably, and of right, as it seemed, conceded to him. A most melodious voice, which rolled richly on the air, and was that of Cicero, addressed the last mentioned person. Quote, I esteem myself happy to stand in the company of one to whom heaven seems to have united me by a certain similarity of fortune and the common glory of saving a state. But the fates have given you an advantage, O most illustrious man, above my lot, in granting you an honorable decline in death amid the regrets of your country, while I fell by the vengeance of the flagitious Antony. Gibbon put up his lip at this speech, and Franklin, who sat with his hands upon his knees between Washington and Gibbon, etc., etc. There's a footnote here that says, the author evidently postponed to another day telling what Franklin's remark or gesture was, in his eagerness to give Gibbon the floor. Quote, Tush, end quote, he said, thoughts and imaginations, I tell thee, man, that I, who have got my bread and fame by informing the world, can write in 20 lines all the thoughts that ever I had, while the imaginations would fill 1,000 fair pages. End quote. March 6th, 1823. My brother Edward asks me whether I have a right to make use of animals. I answer, yes, and shall attempt to give my reasons. A poor native of Lapland found himself in midwinter destitute of food, of clothing, and light, and without even a bow to defend himself from the beasts. In this perplexity he met with a reindeer, which he killed and conveyed to his hut. He now found himself supplied with oil to light his lamp, with a warm covering for his body, and with wholesome and strengthening food, and with bowstrings withal, whereby he could again procure a similar supply. Does any mind question the innocence of this starving wretch in thus giving life and comfort to a desolate family in that polar corner of the world? Now there is a whole nation of men precisely in this condition, all reduced to the alternative of killing the beasts or perishing themselves. Let the tender-hearted advocate of the brute creation go there, and choose whether he would make the beasts his food or be himself theirs. March 10th. The mixture of the body and the soul is the great wonder in the world, and our familiarity with this puts us at ease with all that is unaccountable in our condition. Providence, no doubt, scrupulously observes the proportions of this mixture, and requires for the soundness of both a fixed equilibrium. The gross appetites of the body are sometimes indulged until the mind, by long disuse, loses the command of her noble faculties, and one after another, star after star, they are gradually extinguished. Those passages and conduits of thought, of divine construction, through which God intended that the streams of intellect should flow in various directions, because they have never been used, have fallen to ruin and are choked up. Mind, from being the free-born citizen of the universe and the inheritor of glory, has become the caterer and the panderer of sense. Even the body, from being the upright lord of the lower creation and the temperate owner of 1,000 pleasures, has abused his liberties until he is the slave of those pleasures and the imitator and peer of the beasts. This is one mode of destroying the balance that nature fixed in our compound frame. Ascetic mortification and an unintermitting lifelong martyrdom of the sensual appetites, although far from innocent than the contrary extreme, is nevertheless unwise because it fails of its intended effect. Hermits, who believed that by this merciless crucifixion of the lusts of the body they should succeed in giving to the wind the rags and tatters of a corrupt nature, and elevate and purge the soul in exact proportion to the sufferings of the flesh, have been disappointed in their hopes. At least, if they succeed in their deceiving themselves, they have grievously disappointed the world. But these golden dreams of rapid amelioration of the world to issue from the prayers and penances that stormed heaven from these solitudes vanished away. The solitary man was as other men are. His sufferings had soured his temper or inflamed his pride. The current of thought had been checked and frozen. His powers and dispositions were diverted from useful ends and were barren and selfish. Instead of the blessed plant which they thought had sprung for the healing of the nations was a dry and withered branch. It was sundered from its root, producing neither blossoms nor leaves nor fruits. 'Twas fit only for the fire. March 12th. But there was an elder scripture, a prior command: love thy neighbor amid your righteous war against your passions. Forget not that you are a man, that you are one individual of a great and immortal company, who with you are laboring on to attainment of objects which demand all and more than all their faculties to appreciate and reach. That thousands of these are fainting or falling by the way, and will task your utmost benevolence to lend them needful aid. And when a man has duly considered, I think he will be led to undervalue the precious qualities of that man's virtue, who, like the priest and the Levite of the parable, goes on to the other side and extricates himself as he can from the importunity of want or the cries of the dying. The earth which supports him upon her bosom, the common mother of us all, has a right to ask at his hands some return for her bounties, and what immunity it is entitles him to nurse his own unprofitable existence, without putting his shoulder to the wheel or bearing his part of the burden of life, without giving help to the weary or pouring one drop of balm into the wounded heart. I am persuaded that God enforces the law to make the perfection of man's nature consist in a fixed equilibrium of the body and the mind. Those masters of the moral world, who have preserved an undisputed lordship over good minds for ages after they themselves have died, have not gained that rare fortune by any extraordinary manners of life, or any unseemly defiance of the elements or of death. Temperate, unassuming men, they have conformed to the fashions of the times in which they fell, without effort or contempt. God, in their minds, removed the ancient landmarks of thought, or else gave them strength to overleap the boundary, so that they took in a mightier vision of the state of man than their fellows had done. In all this they did not see differently from them, but saw beyond the common limit. Accordingly, it was no part of their pride to be at discord with men upon common matters of every day's observation. Upon trifles of time and sense they all thought alike. Deeper thoughts and remote consequences, far beyond the ken of vulgar judgments, and yet intimately connected with the progress and destinies of society, were the points they fixed their eyes upon, and upon the distinctness with which they were able to detect these, they chiefly valued themselves. It is a delightful relief in the afflicting history of the world. It is a crystal fountain gushing in the wilderness, to remember the men who exercised this peaceful and sublime dominion over human hearts, not cemented by the blood nor shaken by the curses of enemies. Bound like other men to the complicated machine of society, and their fortunes perhaps inseparably linked to the greatness of another house, these minds quietly founded a kingdom of their own, which should long outlast the ruins of that transient dynasty in which it grew. Men of God they were, children of a clearer day, walking upon earth, keeping in their hands the urns of immortality, out of which there streamed the light which reached to far distant generations, that they might follow in their track. The pagan also blessed them. And what follows is a quotation: Something to do with Jupiter, but I do not have a translation. March 13th. And what a motley patchwork of feelings may be found in the crew of their admirers behind them. How many brows are knit, how many hearts yearn of those who resolve to follow, or are content to worship them. Upon what meat did these Caesars feed, that they have grown so great? Did God or man, time or place or chance sow the immortal seed? And how many seats at the table of the gods are yet vacant? And the storehouses of genius and goodness from which each child of the universe may pluck out his share, are they yet exhausted or locked up? And shall those hearts which have throbbed to the secret urgency of the Spirit, perchance it was the same Spirit that urges all existence, shall they faint in the outset? Onward, onward, the sun is already high over your head. Or fearest thou, because the day is waxed late, that time shall lack? I tell thee, the race is for eternity. The windows of heaven are opened, and they whose faces are as the day, seraphim and cherubim, beckon to the children of man and bid him, Be bold. What follows is a Latin quotation of which there is no translation given in English. This is the end of Journal 10 and the Wide World number 9. In the following video, we will pick up with Journal 11, subtitled The Wide World number 10. Thank you for listening.